All right. So good evening, everyone. So tonight, Parshas Vayishlach, we are going to learn about an interesting topic. Really, we're going to talk about the balance between justifiable, appropriate actions and responses to certain situations, especially when it's a negative situation and where maybe a retribution or punishment would be an appropriate action, and how to balance appropriate actions with the proper motive, the proper intent behind the actions. Now, tonight's class, we'll start off with an interesting kind of like history lesson. So, well, you know that the state of Israel, was founded in 1948, and immediately upon recognition as an independent country, Israel was attacked from all sides by hostile neighbors in the War of Independence. And after this, I think you could even call a miraculous victory in the War of Independence, Israel didn't really find any peace after the ceasefire. There were constant attacks from all sides, from hostile neighbors and countries that were still practically at war with Israel. Now, the story that we're going to focus on tonight, a particular story in Israeli history, took place in October of 1953. Now, in this time, so we're just over 5 years, Israel as a country, and there were, a steady stream of small-scale terror attacks from all sides. So you had, coming from the south in Egypt and Gaza, there were incursions into Jewish neighborhoods that resulted in casualties. From the north, from the east, from all sides, they're leaking in from Jordan, there were these attacks. Now, in this particular attack in October of 1953, in the area of what's now called the Ben Gurion Airport in Lod, Israel, there was in the Yehud neighborhood, there was such an attack. Now, the attack was a group of terrorists, a group of, combatants. I think they're called Fehadin. Fehadin. So what they did is they snuck into a neighborhood in Yehud, and they threw, in the middle of the night, in a house, it's dark and everyone's asleep, in the middle of the night they threw a hand grenade into the house, and it murdered a mother and her 2 children. Now, this was a tragic act, and it was a high-profile, like a real heartbreaking loss for this new country, and it's a string of such attacks. And so there was a decision to respond to this attack in what was called Operation Shoshana. Now, Operation Shoshana was named after one of the children that was killed in this particular attack, one of the 2 children that were killed. So Operation Shoshana, at this time, Ben Gurion was the prime minister, and Ariel Sharon was a commander or general, I think, maybe at this point, in the Israeli army, and he took a particular group, Unit 101, and they decided to retaliate. And that's what Operation Shoshana was. So Operation Shoshana was an Israeli incursion into an area called Kibya, or Kibya, Qibya. And they went into this neighborhood. It was at night, and there was retaliation. So you had this group of commandos, this unit, and it ended up being, another way of looking at it, depending on your side of the politics, a massacre. It was called the Kibya massacre. And there were 69 casualties, including many women and children, civilians. And there were 45 buildings, schools, homes, mosques, that were destroyed. Now, so this Operation Shoshana was an international, let's call it a scandal. And there was a lot of international pressure on Israel and threats of pulling support from this country that was in need of friends internationally, and there was just a real uprising as a result of this. Now, the prime minister at the time, Ben Gurion, tried to distance himself from this misstep, let's say, internationally, and this controversial operation, he even made a speech in Knesset, kind of going against it and saying how this was a mistake. Now, as a result of this distance from the decision and from the fallout from the decision, the IDF established, and this is the first slide here, the IDF established a principle called purity of arms. Now, that's the English translation of the term, but purity of arms essentially is the idea that military force was never again to be directed against civilians. And so I went and looked it up and found the language, the English translation. It reads, "The soldier shall make use of his weaponry and power only for the fulfillment of the mission and solely to the extent required. He will maintain his humanity even in combat. The soldier shall not employ his weaponry and power in order to harm non-combatants or prisoners of war, and shall do all he can to avoid harming their lives, body, honor, and property." So this was adopted as in the spirit of the IDF. The IDF spirit is the name of the document, as a principle called purity of arms, and it's been something which Israel has gone at great lengths now for over 60 years to maintain this principle and any subsequent military action. Many times they've been criticized internally for the cost to Israeli soldiers and Israeli lives as a matter of sustaining this principle and fulfilling this principle of the idea of purity of arms. So this was, again, something you could look up, and it's an interesting story in the history of Judaism, and it shows the ethical foundation of military actions in Israel. Now, the reason we bring this up for tonight is because in this week's Torah portion, Parshas Vayishlach, we find a dramatic story that has the same ethical problem at its core as Operation Shoshana. In this week's Torah portion, we have the story of Yaakov and his return to Israel after 20 years in Haran building a family. After having left the land of Israel to make this family, after 20 years away, he returns to Israel. And in his return, his daughter, Dinah, is abducted. She's kidnapped by this prince, Shechem, and she's violated. And it's really a scandal in the family. You know, here they have what you could consider relative peace, even in a foreign land, in Haran. He's able to build a family, and there's no major incident. Now, it's not easy, it's difficult, and there's a lot of headaches living with his father-in-law. It's not simple, but there's nothing like this. And yet here he returns to Israel, and there's this tremendously difficult story. Now, what we're going to see, in order to connect the two ideas, Operation Shoshana, this week's Torah portion, is what was the response of Yaakov's children? What was the response of the family to this story? So that's the first text in this week's Torah portion, Parshas Vayishlach, in the book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis, chapter 34, verses 1 through 4. The translation reads, "Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Yaakov, went out to look about among the daughters of the land. And Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her, lay with her, and violated her." So this is the scandal. "And Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, 'Take this girl for me as a wife.'" So this is like the setup. A few brief lines to describe this tragic story. Now, Yaakov's sons, who are Dinah's brothers, were outraged. And they decided to take action in response to this violation. So what was the response? So Shechem, you see from the text, wanted to marry Dinah. So they convinced, the sons of Yaakov, convinced the men of Shechem to circumcise themselves. Now this circumcision, this mass circumcision, was all part of a plan. All part of a plan to exact revenge and to assault and kill all the men of Shechem. Now Shechem is both the name of a person and the name of a place, right? So the name of the place is named after this person. So that brings us to the next text, which is further along in the story. It says, thereupon Yaakov's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with cunning, and they spoke because after all he had defiled their sister Dinah. And they said, we cannot do this thing, to give our sister to a man who has a foreskin, for that is a disgrace to us. But with this, however, we will consent to you. If you will be like us, that every male will be circumcised. Here's the plan, get them all circumcised. And all those coming out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male, all who go out of the gate of a city, became circumcised. Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that Yaakov's two sons, Shimon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword, and they came upon the city with confidence, and they slew every male. So this is the response. It's a military response to this action of violation of their sister Dinah. So in this story, what we see is a major question. Again, an ethical question at its core, just like Operation Shoshana. So the question is, how could the sons of Yaakov commit what looks like a war crime? It looks like an atrocity for them to go and slaughter every man of an entire city in response to the action of one person violating their sister. I mean, they're standing up for the sister's honor, that there maybe should be some response, that we can understand, but how could they go so far to kill everyone, as the text says? Now, Nachmanides, the Ramban, asked this question, quite succinctly. And he says, many will ask, how did Yaakov's righteous sons commit this act to spill innocent blood? So we have really two clauses here which really perfectly kind of set up the ethical dilemma. On the one hand, they're righteous sons, right? That's what he calls them. And on the other hand, he's saying that they're spilling innocent blood. So how do you reconcile these two things? The act of the righteous and the blood of the innocent. How do these two things go together? Now it's important to keep in mind, at this point, and really throughout rabbinic literature and Jewish tradition, we think of Yaakov's children as entirely righteous. There's an expression that says, mitasei shlema, that about Yaakov's children, that all of his children were righteous. It says about Abraham, he had one kid that followed his path and one kid that didn't, and then same thing with Yitzchak. But Yaakov, it says, all of his children were completely righteous. And to the extent that we call the whole establishment of the 12 tribes of Israel is the 12 sons of Yaakov. The breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, the divine communication device through which God will miraculously communicate through the Kohen Gadol with the Jewish people. Inscribed in each of the stones of the breastplate is the names of the tribes. So they represent a paradigm of righteousness and the foundation of the Jewish people. So it's not easy to just wash it away and say, well, these were the two bad ones, these were righteous people. So how do we reconcile their actions of spilling innocent blood with their standing as holy people? Now, this question will become stronger when we think about this act of killing civilians, killing people, and this military response, when we begin to look for precedent, let's say. How did Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov think about such a matter? How did they, what was their view on the use of force against the innocent? So we have an objection of the patriarchs. So First of all, we're going to see all the text, but first we see in the thread of the biblical narrative, we see first that Abraham objected upon hearing God's plan to wipe out the city of Sodom. So that's one level of what we're going to analyze. The other is Abraham, in this level, was also concerned about his own actions of wiping out civilians when he was involved in a war, which we'll soon talk about. And Yaakov was also concerned about his own personal involvement in violence and killing innocent people. So from the narrative, we see there's clearly an emphasis on protecting the lives of the innocent, protecting the lives of non-combatants. So this makes the question we have on the actions of Shimon and Levi even stronger. Okay, so let's see. The first text number 3 from earlier in the book of Genesis, it reads, "And Abraham approached and said, 'Will you even destroy the righteous with the wicked?'" Now the context over here is Abraham has been informed by the angels of God about the plan to wipe out the city of Sodom and Amorah. These two places filled with wicked people. So Abraham is arguing with God back and forth. Well, you can't wipe out everybody because maybe there's righteous people there. And you can't wipe out the righteous with the wicked. So far be it, this is Abraham's objection, continued. Far be it from you to do such a thing such as this, to put to death the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be like the wicked. Far be it from you, God. Will the judge of the entire earth not perform justice? So Abraham is questioning this whole measure of divine retribution, that this doesn't make sense. This isn't the way God should act. Now, there's a principle in combat, expression is collateral damage, that if you have a legitimate military target, and the only way you're going to be able to hit a legitimate military target is if there's going to, without intent, there's going to be just, by way of course, death to civilians. So there's like a formula to figure like what's an acceptable amount of collateral damage. But the whole idea that there may be civilian casualties as a result of hitting a legitimate military target is considered acceptable. So it's a principle of war, this concept of collateral damage. So Abraham, in a different context later, when he has to save, when he has to save Lot and from battle, Lot is captured when this war between the 5 kings and the 4 kings we spoke about a few parshas ago when it happened. So the 5 kings and the 4 kings, Abraham has to wage war in order to save Lot. So while he's involved in battle, he's concerned about this same matter, about collateral damage. So that's earlier, chapter 15 of the book of Genesis. After these incidents, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, "Fear not, Abraham, I am your shield. Your reward is exceedingly great." So what should Abraham be afraid of about when he's about to go into this battle? So Rashi, the Medrash explains, Abraham feared that among the peoples he had killed was a righteous tzaddik, or one who feared heaven. So here, Abraham is worried that some of the combatants aren't guilty. Or maybe they're not combatants, they're righteous people, and he killed them as collateral damage, in war. So Abraham had to be reassured by God that that didn't happen. So again, we see this concern by Abraham. Now, later on, Yaakov himself, Shimon and Levi's father, he also shows his commitment to this principle of purity of arms that we've spoke about before. Now, here the idea is that Yaakov, if we remember, ran away from Esau. And when he comes back to the land of Israel, he finally has to have that showdown face-to-face with Esau. And the last thing Yaakov heard from Esau directly was that Esau said, "I'm going to kill you." So Yaakov had to take that threat seriously. And here he is returning to have this showdown with his children and with his wives and with his estate, and he is distressed by the prospect of violence when he encounters Esau. So that's text 5a. Just a couple chapters previous to the story of Dinah, says Yaakov became very frightened and was distressed. So he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks, and the cattle, and the camels, into two camps. So what was he afraid of? Here, that's what Rashi explains. Rashi explains Yaakov became afraid and distressed. He was frightened lest he be killed, and he was distressed that he might kill others. So when the language appears to be, a duplicate language, he's frightened and distressed, and what's the difference? So the fear is for himself. The distress is that he might kill others, people who are innocent, and defend himself in any kind of showdown with Esau. So what we see from the examples of Abraham and Yaakov is the importance of avoiding unnecessary killing. Even during war, in the case of Abraham, it's a firm principle of morality, of ethics, of within the biblical narrative, that our patriarchs reaffirmed over and over again not to kill innocent people. So that just strengthens our first question, which is, how could Shimon and Levi, two of the righteous, as Nachmanides said, two of the righteous sons of Yaakov, how could they have acted in such a way to wipe out everyone in the city of Shechem? All right, that's our first question. That's the setup. We have a contemporary historic event, and the Jewish response, which seems to be very much in harmony with the biblical narrative of the stories of Abraham and Yaakov, and it just shines a light on this week's parsha and brings a very strong question: what were Shimon and Levi doing? Okay, so in the next part, what we're going to do is we're going to take like a little bit of a detour to present some important information about the events that led up to the Dinah story, to this and the response to Shechem from Shimon and Levi. Now, the events of this story come as quite a shock. Obviously because of the tragic events with Dinah, but they also become as a shock as to the timing of the event. Now, the timing of the event, what we mean by this is that Yaakov, like I said before, was in Haran for 20 years. And he built a family there. And he had relative peace. As far as there were no major acts of violence, there was no war, there was no, major issues. Now, this relative peace comes as the result of a promise that God made to Yaakov to protect him. When Yaakov is leaving the land of Israel, he has his dream and he has this encounter with God. God promises that he would protect him wherever he goes. And God kept his word. Now, Yaakov grew prosperous as a result of this protection. He got married, he raised a family, he became wealthy, and here, even when he comes back to Israel and has his showdown with Esau, everything ends peacefully. So the context is Yaakov has been promised, the promise has gone well, the return back to home has gone well. So within this promise, we expect things to kind of continue this way. So now, all of a sudden, it shifts tragically to the story of Dinah. How could this have happened? So the next text we're going to show is a medrash, which shows that there's a broken promise here. God promised Yaakov protection, but then Yaakov also promised something to God. So let's see how this works. So text 6a is from the book of Genesis. It says, God said to Yaakov, this is right after the Dinah story, arise, go up to Bethel, reside there, and make there an altar to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So why, after the Dinah story, is Yaakov told to show this gratitude to God? We would have thought that should have happened already immediately after the encounter with Esau. Remember, God was telling him that he would protect him when he was fleeing from Esau. He came back and already had that encounter with Esau. So the promise seems to have been fully kept by God. As soon as the promise was kept and the Esau story was finished, that's when Yaakov seemingly should have went. Why now, after the promise looks a little shaky on God's part, how did you let this happen to my daughter? It looks shaky on God's part. Why now is God appearing to Yaakov and telling him, go and build this altar and give thanks? So the next text, the Medrash explains. So the Medrash explains, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, these troubles only came upon you because you delayed the fulfillment of your vow. If you seek to avoid further distress, that's what the verse means. Arise and go up to Bethel and abide there, and make an altar at that place you originally made your vow to me. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a monument after stopping there on the way to Haran years earlier, where you vowed a vow. Said the Holy One, blessed be He, to Yaakov, at a time of distress, you dedicate. At a time of favor, you forget. When you were in trouble, you vowed. And once you're comfortable, you forgot. This is a powerful principle. You know what they call it? There are no atheists in a foxhole, right? Have you heard this expression? When times are tough, that's when we're turning to God. But there's an unfortunate tendency to forget about this belief when times are better. We actually find a fascinating insight along this line when prayer, the only prayer that is biblically mandated, biblically ordained, or given to us rather, is the prayer to the blessing after meals. It says, Ve'achalta, v'savata, uverachta. The verse in the Torah, it says, you will eat and be satisfied, and then you will bless. And one of the insights that the commentaries bring out, and along the lines of this point we're making over here, is that when you're hungry and you don't have anything to eat, that's when it's easy to bless God and turn to God and ask for food. But once you've eaten and you're satisfied, then it's not so easy anymore. But to remain aware that it's God who's the one who provided that satisfaction, God who gave you that sustenance, that's when you bless God. So that's what the Medrash is explaining, is what's gone wrong here. When Yaakov was running away, he was quick to make a vow. I'm going to dedicate this place to God. You'll protect me, and I'll make a house for God. But here he gets back after 20 years, and he's in Israel for a while. He didn't keep his vow. So that's the next text, text 7a. It says, and Yaakov traveled to Sukkot. This is, again, you look at the verses, it's prior to the Dinah story, right before. Yaakov traveled to Sukkot and built himself a house, and for his cattle he made booths. Therefore he named the place Sukkot. So I'll point out, I wish I had like a little highlighter. I probably do have a way to highlight these things, but I don't know how to do it. So you see Sukkot, house, and Sukkot. So you have three mentions of dwelling places in one verse. So that immediately kind of jumps out at you, like what's going on. And so the verse continues, and Yaakov came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city, and he bought the part of the field where he had pitched his tents from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 kestitos.
That first one, if he traveled to Sukkot, it means it already had the name Sukkot.
Right.
And then he's naming it Sukkot after it was already named because he knew what it was, because that's where he went.
Right.
So it seems sort of like, wait a minute, was it already called it?
Or
why would he name it? Or did he name it and he's just saying that he went there because ultimately he'll name it Sukkot?
Good question. So Rashi actually jumps out and says, like, the Sukkot means something else over here as well. So what does it mean? So Rashi says, and he built himself a house. So he stayed there 18 months, Rashi points out. How do we know this? Because it's summer, winter, and summer. Now in Judaism, we really only reckon with 2 seasons. There's summer and winter. And here, we've got 4 seasons, right? Actually, and I think the joke goes that Michigan only has 2 seasons: winter and road repair.
Right. Construction.
Those are 2 seasons here in Michigan.
Yep.
So, but in the Torah and in Israel and our prayers places we talk about 2 seasons: summer and winter. So Rashi says Sukkot means summer, and a house means winter. So we have 2 times Sukkot in the verse and 1 times a house. So that's 3 seasons, or a year and a half.
Got it.
So this, the Medrash is pointing out, or Rashi is pointing out, is the cause for this terrible misfortune that Yaakov experienced. God was telling him, you didn't keep your part of the deal. You didn't show gratitude for the protection that you experienced these last 20 years. So now that you broke your vow, I'm not keeping mine to protect you. And go and keep your end of the deal so that you don't keep having these types of problems. So this was like a little kind of like digression. Now we're going to go back to return to our original question, which was, how do we understand the actions of Shimon and Levi? How do we reconcile, the Rambam asked the question, how do we reconcile their status as righteous people and their actions of spilling innocent blood? Now, all right, so one way to understand their actions is to look at Yaakov's reactions to what they did. Meaning, did they act appropriately, or what's the nature of their actions based on how Yaakov himself responded to what they did? Remember, we already quoted from the story of Yaakov that he's the one who's demonstrated previously that he's concerned about spilling innocent blood. That's what he was distressed about when he was meeting with Esav. So how did Yaakov respond to Shimon and Levi? Now, what we're going to see from a close analysis of Yaakov's response is that this isn't a simple matter. This isn't so simple. It's a multi-phased response to these actions. Now, at first, Yaakov is upset, we'll say, by the actions. And he has harsh words for his sons. But what we're going to see from these harsh words is there's a very narrow focus on what it is exactly he's upset about. It appears that he's not really so upset from the act itself of what Shimon and Levi did, but really he's seemingly more concerned about the effect of their actions. What's the consequences of their actions? Essentially saying, it wasn't necessarily wrong what you did, it was just a bad move strategically. And if the implications of your actions are could be negative for us. So let's see how this works. Oh, we went over this slide. Okay, so text 8a. So this is later in chapter 34, in the Dinah story. Thereupon Yaakov said to Shimon and Levi, you have troubled me to discredit me among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites, among the Perizzites, and I am few in number, and they will gather against me, and I and my household will be destroyed. So Yaakov is expressing fear about how vulnerable he is. They're small in number, they're in this hostile environment, and wiping out one place may cause there to be a response from the neighbors. But what's notable over here is he doesn't mention a word about the people they just wiped out. He doesn't condemn the action itself. He's just concerned, seemingly, about the consequences. So what is the response of Shimon and Levi? So that's text 8b. They said, shall we make our sister like a harlot? And then the story's over. There's no more response. Yaakov, that's the end of the dialogue, seemingly, between Yaakov and Shimon and Levi. So from Yaakov's response, the question is kind of just hanging there. Did Yaakov accept this defense? Did Yaakov have no problem with their actions, other than that it was a bad strategic move? Is this the same Yaakov who was concerned about his own actions causing the death of innocents? Now, if we fast forward to when Yaakov was on his deathbed, and he gathers his children to bless them one final time before he passes, we see that Yaakov takes a different approach to addressing the actions of Shimon and Levi. And here, he seemingly does condemn their actions as negative in and of themselves, not just for the consequences. So in text 9a, 15 chapters ahead in the book of Genesis, it says, Shimon and Levi are brothers, violent. The word Hamas. They're violent. Another definition, another way of defining the word Hamas is stolen instruments are their weapons. So either violent instruments are their weapons or stolen instruments are their weapons. This is how he's addressing them on his deathbed. Now, again, in context, a lot of other brothers are just getting these wonderfully poetic blessings. You know, so here, what does Shimon and Levi get? You guys are violent. You guys are stealing things. Let my soul not enter their council. My honor, you shall not join their assembly. For in their wrath, they killed a man. And with their will, they hamstrung a bull. Cursed be their wrath, for it is mighty, and their anger, because it is harsh. I will separate them throughout Yaakov, and I will scatter them throughout Israel. So here we see a much stronger tone, a much harsher reaction to Shimon and Levi's acts with Shechem. So what changed? So first, if we look closely about this word, violent instruments or stolen instruments, what does it mean, stolen? So Rashi explains the word stolen instruments. He explains this craft of murder is in their hands wrongfully, for it is part of Esau's blessing. It is his craft, and you, Shimon and Levi, have stolen it from him. Meaning this is not how the children of Yaakov act. This is how Esau acts. So your response to Shechem of this violence, this was stolen craft from Esau. And when it says, for in their wrath they killed a man, Rashi makes it clear. This is talking about Hamor and the men of Shechem. So it's a whole different tone now of how Yaakov is responding to Shimon and Levi. So this raises, I guess, an obvious question is, what did Yaakov think originally? And what was he thinking now? Because in the narrative in this week's Parsha, he seems to have accepted Shimon and Levi's actions at the time. He seems to have only been concerned about the consequences of their actions. And then he seemingly even accepts their defense for what they said. And yet here, at the end of his life, many years later, he's condemning their actions. What changed? So we're back to Nachmanides. But before we get to the Nachmanides, so first, Yaakov's initial reaction is that his sons did something wrong, but it wasn't anything necessarily bad, and it looks like Yaakov accepted their defense. So now, here's the Nachmanides I was referencing. So here, Yaakov only told them that they had endangered him. As it said, you troubled me to discredit me. There, at the blessings, he cursed their wrath because they committed injustice against the people of the city. So what changed?
And why?
Yeah, and why, exactly. Now, first, one thing we could say, how we try to unpack this, is maybe Yaakov changed his mind, right? Maybe he thought one way and he changed his mind. And he would have changed his mind in the interpretation of their actions. Were these good or bad? Now, at the time, he was only concerned about seemingly the repercussions. Now, the concerned repercussions didn't happen, so what would have changed his mind? All right, so in order to unpack this, we're going to go in one interesting direction, which is that Yeah, go ahead, you.
I had a question.
Sure.
Okay. Well, he wasn't honest himself, Jacob, because he was tricky too.
Okay.
When he stole the blessing.
Right.
So the stealing part, really, they got that from him.
Yeah, the cunning, the mirma they got from him. But the stealing the craft, exactly, meaning it's like, this isn't for you. Meaning it's kind of a not actually stealing. They're saying that this is not an appropriate way of acting for you, so you kind of stole it from someone else.
But why did he say their uncle instead of him?
Because Esav is the one who is murderous. Yaakov has no murder on his record.
But he was cunning.
Yeah, cunning for sure. It's actually the verse. If we go back earlier, I forgot to make the printouts today, but when you go back earlier, it says that Shimon and Levi acted with cunning with the people of Shechem, convincing them to have a bris. And that word, cunning, mirma, is used in both cases. Yaakov's mirma and Shimon and Levi's mirma. They both acted in a way of cunning. So that's for sure. But here, the Yaakov didn't ever murder anyone. That's the stealing from Esav's approach to killing people.
Okay.
Now, so one thing to unpack is, was this bad or not? Was this considered innocent blood or not? So we're going to present an interesting approach to how, according to many of the biblical commentaries, the people of Shechem were not innocent. Their blood was not innocent blood. There was sort of say like a lack of justice in Shechem, which justified a capital punishment.
So like Sodom, where it was like almost everybody.
Very good. I'm glad you went there, because we questioned, this whole approach about the forefathers and innocent blood, and we started with Abraham's questioning of God. If you remember, there's a whole negotiation over there, right? Abraham starts off with, let's like practically an auction. Give me 50, give me 50. Do I hear 50? Is there 50 righteous people? If there's 50 righteous people, then we won't do it, right? No 50. Okay, what about 40? 40 people. Do I hear 40? And it's like, no, there's no 40. And like they work their way down and down and down. And finally, Abraham's like, well, I guess there's nobody righteous here to save. And he relents. Now, and that's when everybody's wiped out. So we could take the same kind of approach here. The strength of our question until now has been, well, maybe all the people of Shechem didn't deserve this. And this is, how do we reconcile the act that the Rambam asked? And it's shedding innocent blood. So one line of thinking found in the commentaries is that this isn't innocent blood. They deserved a punishment like this. How do they deserve punishment like this? So the Talmud starts off, so we have the text. Talmud introduces a principle in Tractate Sanhedrin, which is where we learn the laws of capital punishment in the Torah. So that's a whole tractate with a section dedicated to learning the laws of capital punishment. And over there it says that their prohibitions, meaning the prohibitions of the nations, the Noahide laws, there's this universal code, according to the Torah, that all mankind has to keep, and they're made up of various prohibitions. So when their prohibitions, meaning the prohibitions of the rest of humanity, are violated, then those prohibitions carry within them, or within it, the death penalty. So Judaism, doesn't look for everybody to keep our laws. We're not looking for converts or forcing our prohibitions on others, but there is a certain universal code. And this universal code, if it's violated, the Talmud is saying, incurs capital punishment. Now, Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, in the Laws of Kings, the 9th chapter there, elaborates on this point, and he says, how must the Gentiles fulfill the commandment to establish laws in courts? So there are 6 prohibitions in the 7 laws of Noah, and there's one positive injunction, which is to establish courts for justice. So he says, how do they do this? They do it by, they are obligated to set up judges and magistrates in every major city to render judgment concerning these 6 mitzvahs and to admonish the people regarding their observance. So there's what Maimonides is explaining is that for all mankind, there is a positive responsibility to make sure all the other 6 laws are upheld. They have to do this. And a Gentile who transgresses one of these 7 commands shall be executed. And he even tells us the form, execution by decapitation. Now, for this reason, all the inhabitants of Shechem, Maimonides points out, were liable for the death sentence. Shechem kidnapped, and they observed and were aware of his deeds, but did not judge him. So combining these 2 things, it's one negative commandment, not to kidnap, not to do sexual immorality, also is one of them, and there's a positive injunction for the people of a place to have a way of enforcing the rules. So he broke the rules, Shechem, and they broke the rules by not having the court system to enforce the adherence of the rules. So from what the Talmud and Sanhedrin presents, and what Maimonides presents, is that in such a violation, the response, the punishment, is a capital offense. So it's a pretty straightforward argument, and kind of taking the teeth out of our question that we've been asking so far tonight, is maybe this isn't innocent blood. This was something, like Maimonides said, it's straightforward. This explains their actions. Now, so what ends up happening then is, like, now we have Yaakov, like, what's going on? If it was okay, according to Maimonides and according to the way we're learning this piece of Talmud, then what was Yaakov so upset about on his deathbed? And we see his initial reaction now begins to make more sense, because he's not upset about the essence of the act. It's like saying, you may be right, but it wasn't wise to act in this way, because it endangers us. And now we understand the response of Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi said, well, will we let our sister be made into a harlot? Now, what that means is, like, the question is, what's a greater risk? Yaakov is saying, you're right, according to Maimonides. You're right, this was a proper punishment, but it wasn't smart to do it because it puts us at risk. And their response to them was, well, there's a greater risk if we do nothing. Now, that you might go back to our case in 1953, might have been the rationale to why to have a military response to terrorism. Because what's worse? For us to attack in this way, or to do nothing? Because if we do nothing, that may also be a risk. That's the next text. Let's skip over this part. The next text, the Or Chaim, for in Genesis, where the Shimon and Levi respond to Yaakov and say what they say, says one must understand, what did this answer do for Yaakov's fears that he and his family would be annihilated? Right? He's concerned. There's a risk. He put us at risk. We're vulnerable. So how did that response address it? By saying, what, should we let our sister be made into a harlot? Shimon and Levi's answer was that, on the contrary, if they had not responded, they would be endangering themselves amongst the local peoples. Once they all see how some lowlife seized Yaakov's daughter and did whatever he wanted, they would have no standing amongst the nations of the region. On the contrary, as a result of their actions, their dread fell upon the nations, so they trembled before them. This is like the old wisdom of, if when you're being bullied, like they say, if you just hit the bully back one time, then he'll leave you alone for the rest of the time. You don't normally advise violence, but if sometimes not standing up for yourself just invites further abuse. So that was the response of Shimon and Levi, essentially, is saying, your concern is that we're going to be endangered because of what we did. But we think the risk is even greater if you do nothing. Now, from Yaakov accepting that seemingly as a defense, it still reinforces what Maimonides is saying, seemingly, that the action itself was justified. Now, so then we're left to like, well, what changed? Why should Yaakov have been upset at them when he was on his deathbed? Why should he have been concerned about their wrath and their violence and all these type of things? So here, that's our question. Why did Yaakov disapprove later in his life? So here, I don't think it means sodomites, but the idea of, I think, more the Shechemites is what they mean. They're death, but not by Yaakov's family. And were the brothers justified in doing their killing? And if they were right, then why the harsh words here? And why did they say it later? Is our concern. Now, so here we're going to see another way of learning this, Nachmanides. Nachmanides is going to take issue with Maimonides. And he says like this: in my eyes, Maimonides' words do not seem correct. If so, our father Yaakov, meaning if it was correct that it was justified to kill the people of Shechem under this dereliction of setting up a court and policing the offenses of the prohibitions of the Noahide Code, then if that was the case, our father Yaakov would have been obligated to take part in their capital punishment himself. And if he abstained because he was afraid, then why was he angry with his sons? Why did he curse their anger later on and punish them with separate them and scatter them? Had they done a mitzvah, trusted in God, and were saved by him? So Nachmanides is challenging Maimonides based on this whole flow. So implied in this mitzvah is the duty to set up judges in every city, just as the Jews are obligated to do so. But if they do not do so, they are not killed, since this is a positive commandment. It was only ever said that their prohibitions are capital offenses, and only abstaining to fulfill negative commandment can be considered a prohibition. So Nachmanides has an alternative understanding of the justification for Shimon and Levi. He's left to come up with an alternative. So that's what we're going to see next. And Nachmanides, once he gives his alternative explanation, will now have the grounds to show that Yaakov never accepted their actions, never accepted their defense. And that's the difference between the beginning and the end. That's how you reconcile it, is that he didn't think it was justified and therefore justified another way and never accepted their defense. Let's see how that works. Nachmanides continues, the people of Shechem, along with all of the 7 nations inhabiting the land of Canaan at that time, engaged in idol worship, sexual immorality, and every other abomination. Thus the Torah decried their conduct in numerous places, as it says, for all of these abominations they committed. It was not entrusted to the sons of Yaakov to bring them to justice, but the sons of Yaakov considered the blood of the people of Shechem like water, since they were wicked and thus their lives were already forfeited. And therefore Shimon and Levi wanted to avenge them with a vengeful sword. Yaakov said to them over here that they had put him in danger, and over there may their anger be cursed for killing them without cause, since they had not wronged them personally at all. So he's saying that, it wasn't wrong, but it wasn't for you to do, essentially what Nachmanides is saying. You can reconcile their righteousness with the innocent blood by saying it's not innocent blood per se, but you didn't have to do it. And that's Yaakov's approach, why if you don't have to do it, I could be still upset about it years later on my deathbed to say that you shouldn't have done it. Now, so we have, just to summarize this third part over here, we have Maimonides and Nachmanides have both tried to reconcile this problem of, was it justified? If it was justified, what explains Yaakov's change of heart? So one justification, and essentially, when you put the two together, you have 2 half answers. Maimonides has been challenged by Nachmanides, and Nachmanides has only kind of partially justified the actions in the first place. So we still don't fully understand yet how to reconcile Shimon and Levi's actions and Yaakov's evolving response to their actions. All right, any questions before we go on to the last part? No? Okay, so the last part is like this. The Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, reads the story as a very fascinating concept. I mentioned at the beginning of the class, what we're going to talk about is how to balance justified responses to negative situations with proper motive. So everybody's saying this balance, this attempt to find balance, helps us understand Yaakov's complaint against his sons on his deathbed. He's focusing less on the actual actions that everybody explains than on their motives. What Yaakov is concerned about is their motive for their actions. Now, the idea is that whichever defense you'll accept, Maimonides, Nachmanides, the actions were justified. There was nothing essentially wrong in the Dinah story with what Shimon and Levi did. But what Yaakov came to understand, and why there was different responses from the moment it happened to later in his death, what changed is that Yaakov became aware of the intent, the motive of his children. He originally thought that the motive was holy or pure or correct, and he only came to understand later that the motive was not correct. So the question is, what changed? What changed his mind? What made him think differently about the motive? So what happened in between to change Yaakov's mind was the story of Yosef. And we didn't get there yet this year, but you guys have all been regular attendees at the Parsha class, so I can assume that you still remember what happened in the Yosef story. But so we'll just quickly review. Yosef is the favorite son of Yaakov, and he's hated by his brothers. And that ends up being a challenge for him. And in the challenge of Yosef, his brothers try to kill him. Now, who were the two masterminds behind the scheme to kill Yosef? Shimon and Levi.
Right. Same guys.
Now, it's only because of intervention from Reuven that they don't kill him. And they end up settling on a less harsh course of action, which is just to kidnap him and sell him as a slave. That's not very nice, but it's better than killing him, right? But Shimon and Levi wanted to kill him. So this insight into the actions of Shimon and Levi from Yosef's story helped change how Yaakov interpreted their actions by the Dinah story. Because you could justify in some way their actions in the Dinah story, and this is the first action like this on their record, he assumed the best. He interpreted it positively. Now, it's maybe not wise, it wasn't a good strategic move, but it was justifiable, and so he didn't react negatively. If you insert the Yosef story in between, that's when Yaakov comes to understand Shimon and Levi in a different way. And as a result of this change of understanding, that's what brings him to the change of heart, where he's condemning them on his deathbed.
So now he's got multiple proofs.
Yeah. What do you call it? Convergent validity or something, or validation or something like that. All right. So this is the Rebbe's explanation. So this is from Kutei Sicha, this is volume 5. The Rebbe explains, when Shimon and Levi initially responded to Yaakov, "Shall he make our sister like a harlot?" he accepted their response. This was they were avenging their sister's honor. Nevertheless, he rebuked them for their actions later on, because once he saw that they killed a man in their wrath, and then hamstrung the bull, it was proven to him that they have a natural tendency for violence, and that this tendency contributed to their actions in Shechem.
Meaning their motivations weren't pure.
Right. Now, hamstringing the bull, it's important to understand what that means. The bull, in this case, is Yosef. When Yosef gets his blessings from Yaakov, he's described, again, poetically in his blessings as the bull. And so when we talk about hamstringing the bull in that example is Yosef. So it's the combination of what took place in Shechem with what they did to Yosef that changes the way Yaakov interpreted these actions. Meaning, and this is where we're going to come to the lesson, you could have a proper, justifiable response to a negative situation, to a challenging circumstance. But just because it's morally and legally justified doesn't necessarily mean that your intent is proper. Now, so Shimon and Levi, when they said that their intent was just to protect the honor of their sister, and as we saw deeper, it meant to protect them from future vulnerabilities of attack by showing a strong front, then that seems fine. But Yaakov later understood that their intent wasn't so pure. This was coming from a place of natural violence. So the idea is that it's important to reckon both the motive as well as the propriety of certain behavior, and to balance the two. Now there's one last example over here of this idea of balancing motive and justification for actions. Is the example of Egypt. Now in Egypt, Paro is seen pretty much as the bad guy, right? Justifiably, right? But Paro is the villain of the story. Now, but there's been many questions which have been asked by the rabbis, by the biblical commentaries, as to what did Paro do to deserve such retribution, right? 10 miraculous plagues. That didn't seem fair. Why should he be wiped out for a whole year such a way? It doesn't seem like it's fair. Now, you might say, what do you mean it's not fair? He's a villain. He did terrible things. This is his punishment. But what it says is that in the narrative, where the questions really come up strong from the rabbis, is it tells us in the narrative that God hardened Paro's heart. Paro, had his heart not been hardened by God, he would have let the Jews go after experiencing just a few of these plagues. So God is hardening Paro's heart in order so that he should keep the Jews there, so plague after plague after plague after plague can keep coming. So how is that fair? How is it fair that Paro should get such a retribution only because God is the one hardening his heart, and so he shouldn't let the Jews go? So, okay, so
he's rigging the deck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and how's that fair? So, again, Nachmanides is asking a good question, giving us some good insight for the last few texts. It says, the question that everyone asks is, if God hardened his heart, what was his crime? Now, so this is a problem, and this is the last text of the night that ever gives us a solution, which really echoes or illustrates the explanation he gave in regards to Shimon and Levi. So this is a different source in Likkutei Sichos of the Rebbe. It says, Paro's refusal to let the Jewish people go was not only because God had hardened his heart, but also because he had strengthened his own resolve not to send off the Jewish people. Therefore, he was deserving of punishment. And this is similar to the answer proposed for the question of why God punished the Egyptians for enslaving the Jews, if he himself was the one who declared that they will enslave and oppress them. The Egyptians hadn't been enslaving and oppressing the Jewish people in order to fulfill God's decree, but out of their own wickedness. Therefore, they were punished for it. So it's not just the actions, because if it would be the actions alone, there's a certain justification for the actions of the Egyptians, because God himself promised Abraham that the children would be enslaved in a land not their own. So it's like their destiny, the Egyptians could say. It's justified in a certain way. This is the role you made for us to play. But that wasn't their motive. Their motive wasn't to be, the vehicle through which to fulfill God's decree. Their motive was to oppress the Jews. And since if you would ask them, why are you doing this? They wouldn't say because we know about God's decree and we want to fulfill that, to bring the Jews to their destiny. No, they would say, we're doing this because they're cheap labor and we're building up an empire, or as the Torah says, we don't want them to turn against us when the enemy comes, all these different things. These are negative motives and what may be asked as a justifiable action. So this balance between making sure that our motives are proper when we're doing what could be considered a justifiable action, that balance is the lesson from this story, lesson from tonight's class. Now, the lesson for us is an important lesson that we have to pay attention not just to what we do, but how we do it. And most importantly, why. Why do we do it? Our lesson is and our job from this lesson is to work to ensure that our motives are proper, are pure. Now, an example that comes to mind, a common example I give in classes I see, thinking back on the things I say now that I'm recording them especially, is with children, the disciplining of a parent to a child. Right? Sometimes you have to be stern or even punish your children in order to educate them. Right? That's the proper, justified course of action to give them certain stern punishments in order to discipline them. But why are you doing that? Meaning, are you doing that because it's in the best interest of your children? Or are you doing that because
you're just angry at them?
You're angry, you're emotional, or you're tired, yeah. Or you've had a long day at work, expression, you kicked the dog. You have nobody else you can take out your frustrations on because of this long bad day. So you come home and you scream at your kids. So if that's the reason why, even though it may be justified rationally because of discipline and upbringing, all kind of things, but if that's not why you're doing it, then you shouldn't do it. You should step away. So that's the lesson that Yaakov and Shimon and Levi are teaching us in this story. The actions are troubling. We worked out how we could justify them, and it could be understood. There's even maybe a strategic justification for what they were doing. There's a legal justification for what they're doing that Maimonides provided. And so when we had that to fall back on, Yaakov's initial interpretation of their actions was that it was in order. He didn't protest anymore. But once he had the ability to see a pattern of behavior and understand what was the true motive of what they were doing, they're into violence. They're into violent responses to troubling situations. Once he knew that the motives weren't proper, that's when he rebuked the actions. That's the lesson for us, to have the insight, to have the introspection, the self-awareness, to realize that our actions not only have to be justified, but they have to be proper.
You can't do the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Exactly.
Just a little different. People do the reverse. They tend to justify their actions. Whatever I was motivated to do it, as long as I did it. This is a great example of understanding pretty clearly, you really need to do everything every day based on thinking about why you do it versus not just why you do it versus why do it.
Right, exactly.
Pretty good.
All right. Any questions?
So they would have, if they didn't have stopped at just killing Shechem, that would be probably the right response. That's because they violated their sisters, and that's the response.
Yeah.
Kind
Or, so say like this. A lot of times, you call it, you recuse yourself because of your own bias, right? So if Shimon and Levi had this natural response, which they could even justify, so maybe it would make better sense if they could get like Yisachar and Zvulun to do it. If they could convince somebody of the righteousness of their actions, who it's not their natural response to do that, then it would probably be more appropriate.
And then if Jacob would actually rebuke them, saying, at that time, and they went too far, there would be no Egypt maybe, because if he would stop their behavior right there,
Right.
then maybe they would.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like a bigger like philosophical question. if you would apply the lesson in the past, would that change all the course of history thereafter? But it's a good point, because like if Shimon and Levi didn't want to kill Yosef, then he wouldn't have gotten sold into slavery.
They would do the right thing, and there would be nothing bad would happen.
Right. That's a great philosophical question. Like, if we could have done the right thing in the past, what would have changed in the future? You know?
Right.
That's a whole science fiction series in itself.
Yeah, these alternative history. You know,
Yeah, there's one that's on now that I've been watching called Timeless.
Yeah.
Which basically sort of sends people back in time. You know, one the other night was they send them back in time and they shoot a couple of people. One of them was Benedict Arnold. Well,
yeah.
Benedict Arnold was involved in negotiating some other things later on. So because he was a bad guy then, and you had some other reasons for getting rid of him, think of all the other things you messed up down the line afterwards when you change history.
Yeah. Now, I actually another philosophical. I've heard this asked, like if you could go back in history, should you kill Adolf Hitler?
Right.
Like if you had the opportunity as he's a young boy, you know, should you kill him? And then this philosophical question, which is obviously emotionally loaded as a question, is now applied to like what do you call it? Algorithmic sentencing. They use like algorithms and parole decisions and sentencing decisions, or if you can like do regression analysis and like identify certain criteria of which will lead someone to do a crime, you know, based on the patterns of behavior. Can you arrest somebody before they even do the crime?
Right.
That's really hard to do. I mean, it's controversial.
Or can you keep them in jail longer?
You never know for sure.
Yeah, you never know for sure. But what they are, this is actually happening in certain places in the United States where they're doing sentencing based on these algorithms. Like if you plug in enough of the conditions, you know that it's more likely than not they're going to do this crime if you release them. So let's keep them in prison longer.
Yeah, but you're still punishing an innocent.
Right.
You know, it could be 90%.
Right. It could be, even if unless it's 100%, you shouldn't convict, right? Yeah, see, this is a whole separate, fascinating way to go.
Well,
another question with the guilt, their sin was not established in the court of law, right? No.
According to Maimonides,
According to Maimonides. This is their king. So the people didn't establish court of law. Kings did.
Right.
And even when they did, they were not subject to the court.
Right.
The people couldn't, even if court of law existed, there's probably no chance that the king would be tried.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and that's interesting, because here in the Laws of Kings, Maimonides, where he says this is about how to, also in this context is where Maimonides talks about waging war on other nations. And essentially, like, again, from a little further perspective, as in speaking more globally, a lot of wars have been fought this way. You've decided in your court of laws and your political systems to run the world this way. And we've decided to run the world a whole different way. So we're now going to wage war against you because these ideologies are in conflict. So what Maimonides is saying is this is a Jewish ideology. We say it's universal because God gave it, but it's really the Jews' job to let everybody know that God gave this. So essentially what Maimonides is saying is that you have to wage war to impose a legal system that not everybody's adopted. Which is a really big question, and we see this throughout history, like the Cold War, all these satellite wars in the 20th century of Korea and Vietnam and these places where, communism is uprising in one place and democracy is trying to check the spread of communism and fighting these wars throughout the 20th century because of ideology.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
and
who
those
says
who are in
what's
power,
right?
they write the word, the law. And you can't just, it's the same thing as going to Iraq and trying to tell them that Sharia is bad. You know,
Right.
You have to run this, your country the way we run ours.
Yeah.
That debate goes on more and more now because you got people going, just because we have democracy doesn't mean there's any history or any interest in democracy in all these countries in the Middle East. So can you impose democracy in a place where they really don't want democracy?
And
Right.
Their right is to have no democracy.
There's
There's
So they
a
want
justifying the
presumption
killing.
that
Right.
everybody will accept it, and it's just so obvious that we're so within our laws that
This is the right way,
period.
right?
Right.
This is the right way. So as soon as we open their eyes to,
Yeah, and we're using,
great.
it's fascinating where this discussion is going because we're using this justification in tonight's topic to
Yeah.
kill civilians.
Right. It's same like Hitler. He had his religion and he was justifying his way of
Right.
killing.
Right, his nationalism
Right.
and worldview was
Right.
the justification for murder.
And basically everybody is ISIS.
Yeah,
That's their.
exactly.
Yeah, that's what kind of bothers me, in the modern days. That as soon as, for example, some country like the United States, a big country, says, okay, for example, as an example, homosexuality is okay, and the same sex marriage is okay.
Right.
All of a sudden, the next day, if this law is adopted here, the whole world should be, following. Those
Right.
who are not so good guys.
Right, they're not progressive.
Yeah, they're not progressive.
Yeah.
It happens over and over on different issues. Okay, now we condemn racism from this day, and everybody else should.
Right.
Yeah, they should, but so should have we done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people
Yeah.
have short memories.
Yeah, so it's like why every world, the whole world should be, living the way we're living.
Right.
As of this moment, we change the course next day. They should do the same.
Exactly. Yeah.
Classic example of that one is Thomas Jefferson, and it's covered in some of the plays, like 1776, where he said, everybody should be free, except he held slaves,
Right.
and he held these political beliefs, and he held those political beliefs, none of which we believe would come out of anybody in the right mind today, except this guy was writing the Constitution saying, well, those things are bad, but not in his case, because he felt what he was doing was right.
Right.
Same stuff that goes on through history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is a really good lesson.
Yeah.
This is really food for thought.
I'll go all the way back.
Let's go back to it.
Sure.
Beginning when I first came in, you were saying that what happened to Dinah was a result of Jacob not building God a house.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no. So, I'm not saying that. What we're saying is that God felt he didn't have to live up to his promise to protect Yaakov from such things happening. It wasn't causative. It was just that the supernatural protection that Yaakov had experienced until now was removed. You hear the difference? The way that Rabbi explains it, the prophet describes the Jewish people as a lamb amongst 70 wolves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not natural for the lamb to continue to live among 70 wolves.
Mm-hmm.
That's unnatural. So if you take away the protection, that's not causing the lamb to be slaughtered. It's just that you've taken away the supernatural protection. So that same idea over here. We're not saying that Yaakov's delay caused Dinah's abduction. We're saying Yaakov's delay removed the supernatural protection which would have kept something like this from happening in the first place. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference.
Yeah, because that's what they say in Ecclesiastes, make your vow a vow. If you have any vows before him, make sure you fulfill it.
Right. Sure. Right, because it was not a trade-off necessarily, but they made promises to each other at the same time. God promised to protect Yaakov, and Yaakov promised to dedicate his house to God.
Okay. And also, dedicate the house, dedicate his children.
Yeah.
But two of them just went wild.
That's a good question, because it's a subtle difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
That is really different now.
Let's go to